According to Moda Fabrics, the third Saturday of September is National Sew a Jelly Roll Day. So what better way to celebrate than getting a jelly roll out and sewing it up? This is our 5th video in a series designed to use 2.5-inch strips. I'm also going to use some of my leftover 2.5-inch strips to make another colorway. Stay to the end of the video to see it. The pattern from Moda Fabrics is called Half Step, and we'll put a link in the description below that will take you right to it. One of the pages of the pattern is a handy coloring chart so you can visualize your quilt before you put it together. All it takes is 1 jelly roll and 7/8 of a yard of a background fabric. You'll also need 5/8 yard for a binding and 4 yards for a backing, but I worried about those when the quilt top was done so I could pick something that matched it. Now it's time to cut. I'm going to stack up my strip pieces so that I can cut multiple units at once. You could cut every single strip separately, but I like to save time and cut multiples. Sometimes before I'm going to cut multiple layers like this, I will change the blade in my rotary cutter so that I know that it's nice and sharp. When cutting multiple layers like this, it's also very important to double check every cut before you make it. Make sure you're cutting the right size. The worst thing that can happen is you cut the wrong size, have to sew the strip back together again, and then recut. There's a little wiggle room as far as the length of the strip, but it's always better to check twice, cut once. From each strip, you need to cut 2 rectangles that are 2.5 inches by 6.5 inches, 2 rectangles that are 2.5 inches by 8.5 inches, and 1 rectangle that is 2.5 inches by 10.5 inches. Since the strips are folded in half right now, I can cut 2 of each of the first 2 sizes, and then I'm going to press the last little bit, the folded up part, before I cut the 10.5-inch strip. Each strip represents 3 strips. I've got them stacked on top of each other, so I'm cutting through 6 layers at a time, doing 12 strips at a time. You only need 36 of the jelly roll strips that usually have 40 or 42 strips in them. So you can either cut up the whole jelly roll and have some leftover pieces, or you can pick your strips first and then only use those. Before I cut the ends into the 2.5-inch by 10.5-inch piece, I'm going to take them to the ironing board and press the fold out so that I get a more accurate cut when I stack them to cut the 10.5-inch rectangle. If the fold is really stubborn, use a little steam or spray starch to help convince it to lay flat. The finished size of this quilt will be 60 inches by 60 inches, and it uses 1 jelly roll and 7/8 yard of a background fabric. But if you wanted to use 2 jelly rolls and double the amount of background fabric, you could make up to 80 blocks that would be 10 inches by 10 inches each, and your finished quilt would be 80 by 100. Now that the end of the strips are all flat, I can stack them up and cut all of my 2.5-inch by 10.5-inch rectangles. Make your stacks as high as you want, but make sure that you're comfortable cutting through all those layers. I always make sure to trim up the edge before I cut the size I need for more accurate cuts. I also do this when I start to get rid of the selvage edge. When I say get rid of, I really mean stick the selvages in a bucket to make a selvage quilt someday. And there's just enough left on these strips to cut some 2.5-inch squares to use for a different project. Now that the jelly roll strips are all cut, it's time to cut the background fabric. From the background fabric, cut 6 strips that are 4.5 inches by the width of fabric. From these strips, you will subcut 36 rectangles that are 4.5 inches by 6.5 inches. I like to use my square ruler when I'm doing this, so I will cut at the 9-inch spot first, and then I will move the ruler back and cut from the 4.5-inch spot. As you can see, there's going to be a little bit of extra fabric, but that's for in case you cut something wrong. So always double check when you're cutting that you cut on the 9-inch mark and the 4.5-inch mark. Just like the jelly roll strips, I am going to stack these on top of each other so I can cut multiple layers at once. If you're enjoying our video and want to see more like this one, subscribe to our channel and don't forget to hit that like button. We'd really appreciate it. One thing that's really nice about the pattern, if you print it at home, is it shows you a couple different ways to cut. And one of them is if you're using an ombre fabric to get a gradient kind of look. It also has 4 different variations in color that show you what it looks like using different jelly rolls. So make sure to take a look at that. For this project, you're going to be using 1/4 inch seam allowances. On the pattern, it says all seams are a scant 1/4 inch, but I just used my regular 1/4 inch and it worked out fine. Now that we're all done with the cutting, it is time to sew. So head over to the sewing machine and get yourself set up. Step 1 is sewing the 2.5 inch by 6.5 inch rectangles to the background rectangle. I divided the long rectangles into 2 piles, one of each fabric. So there's 4 different piles, 2 that are 2.5 inch by 6.5 inch and 2 that are 2.5 inch by 8.5 inch. That way I have 1 fabric of each of the fabrics in each of those piles. To help me go through the piecing a little bit faster, I placed the background fabrics on the left and the strips on the right. I put the strips right side down so that when I pick them up, I don't have to turn them over. I only have to place them on the background rectangle. I am also setting aside all of the rectangles of the background fabric that are right side down. Later on, I will take that whole pile and flip it right side up when I get to the bottom of the pile. This is just a handy little trick I learned so I wouldn't have to keep twisting my wrists constantly. Once you're done sewing, it's time to cut them apart. You can either use a small scissors or find one of these blade savers to use. It saves me so much time. I love this thing. Each time you press, you are going to press towards the strip that you just added. So you're always pressing towards the strips. If you always press towards the rectangles, when you go to put your blocks together at the end to make the rows, the very few places where you will have seams that kind of go together, they will nest to make the piecing of the blocks together really easy. I'm sorting out my rectangles by color to make finding the right rectangle easier when I start to sew them together. I'm making my blocks into color families of red, green, aqua, and then those fabrics with a cream background. Now you could also make this a little bit more scrappy and just kind of mix up all the colors, but in my final quilt, I wanted to have kind of diagonal stripes of a single color kind of moving through the quilt. As you add these next strips to the original background fabric with the strips sewn onto it already, you're going to want to always make sure that you're sending the background fabric through the machine first. You just want to make sure you do all the blocks the same way. As I add on the next strips, I'm going to try to use a different fabric each time to spread them around as much as I can. If desired, you could also do 1 fabric per block. It all depends on what you like. The handy coloring sheet in the pattern was very useful to help me try to figure out how I wanted to lay it out. I just counted how many blocks I would have of each of the different colors and kind of plotted how to put them into the quilt. And at the end, it'll give me a guide to follow as I sew the blocks into rows. Now that the pieces are all cut apart, it's time to press. And remember, we're always pressing towards the rectangle that we've just added to the quilt block. When I'm pressing, I usually like to press it flat first and then press towards the strip. It kind of helps set the seam and make it lay a little bit flatter. Now it's time to add on the 8.5 inch rectangles. You're going to piece these onto the side where the first 6.5-inch rectangle is, not on the side with the background fabric. Pressing after you add on each of the rectangle rows is important to make sure you get blocks that lay nice and flat at the very end. Once these are all pressed, then we're going to add the 8.5 inches onto the other side where the 6.5-inch rectangle is. Once the blocks get a little bit bigger, they're harder to control when you're cutting them apart using the blade saver. I use this hand over hand crossover method to help speed it up at this stage. Time to press, and then there's just one more rectangle to add to each of these blocks. The blocks are starting to look so pretty. Now it's time to piece on the last rectangles. Make sure that you're piecing it to the side where the strips are, not where the background fabric is. Yay, the blocks are all sewn. Now it's time to do one last pressing before we start putting our rows together. I'm going to find my chart and then just use it to follow along and sew the rows together one by one. I'm just going to work on one row at a time. I'm going to sew sets of 2 blocks together, and then I will sew the 2 block sets together to make the row of 6 blocks. I have it color coded by the color and then the number of blocks that I have of each of the colors. So I just have to match it up according to the chart. And then as I sew them together, I'm going to mark them off so I know that I've sewn those 2 pieces together. The nice thing about marking the chart as I go is if I have to walk away from the project for any length of time, it'll be easy to pick it right back up where I left off without confusing myself. The chart also helps me make sure I have the block positioned correctly so that the background fabric is in the right place. I'm just going to work on one row at a time, and as I finish the row on the very left block, I'm going to place a safety pin for each row that I'm doing. So the first row will have one safety pin, the second row will have two, and so on. When I go to put the rows together, I just have to line them up by the safety pins 1 through 6, and I don't have to try to figure out which way it goes. There aren't many places where you have to match seams for this one, but this is the one spot where you will, and they just nest together, so you don't even need to use pins if you don't want to. You just sew part of it and then make sure you've got them nested together and keep feeding them through the machine. Now that all the rows are together, I'm going to lay it out on the floor and double check that I've sewn everything correctly, that the pattern looks the way that it should. If you want to, you could press all of the rows now. What I tend to do is to just press the first one, and then as I'm pressing each successive row, it will get pressed when I do the long seam where they're sewn together. It saves me a step and it prevents me from pressing the rows the wrong way. So it's very helpful for me just to do one at a time. And since that seam hasn't been pressed yet, it will go whichever way it needs to go to nest against the other seam. Now that all the rows are sewn together, we'll just take it to the ironing board one last time to give it a final pressing. And while I'm giving it that final pressing, I will also take out all of my safety pins that help me mark the rows. One last check before I machine quilt it. Now that the quilt top is done, I can pick out my backing. I decided to use a cuddle fabric on the back to make it extra cozy. I used warm and natural batting and a stipple for the quilting design, and my quilt is done. I have it bound. For the binding, I picked out a fabric that looked like a stripe that was on a diagonal, so it has a really cool effect on the edge. The thread color that I used for the quilting was not quite white. It was kind of a little bit of a cream color, so it kind of blends in really well through all the fabrics. This was such an easy quilt to make, I decided I wanted to make another one in a different colorway. I looked through all my buckets, the black and pink, the Halloween, the pastel. Should I do it in browns or maybe Christmas? Greens, multicolor? Or maybe just pick random strips out of my big bucket of strips. Well, I decided I wanted to go with a pastel version. I sorted the strips by color to get some sort of sense on how many blocks of each color I could do. And then I colored in a diagram to know how many to cut of each color. Remember, each block needs 2 rectangles that are 2.5 by 6.5, 2 rectangles that are 2.5 by 8.5, and 1 rectangle that's 2.5 by 10.5. I found a white fabric to use for the background, and then I picked some of the strips to make a scrappy binding. I didn't quite use up the whole bucket, but I'll keep trying. And then I spent a whole evening sewing the blocks together. It didn't take very long. I got it done in one sewing session. I followed my chart to sew the rows together, and here's what the quilt top looks like. I picked out a cute little print for the backing and just a tiny little floral that has most of the colors that I used on the front. And then I did my scrappy binding for the very edge. I machine quilted it with warm and natural batting and a design that has little tiny loops in it. And then every once in a while I threw in what looks like a little flower or a little butterfly. This last little project didn't help me use up much of my fabric strip stash, but I'll just keep having to work on it. Before this video, I had 6 buckets of strips, and I still have 6 buckets of strips, but there's always next month. We hope you enjoyed our video. Please make sure to hit the like button, leave us a comment, share with your quilting friends, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and happy quilting!